The opening scene features So-Yeon, a kind woman who works as a groomer in a pet shop called Kitty and Puppy. She is currently going through her routine task, this time bathing a Persian cat named Bidanyi and styling it as well. A short while later, Bidanyi's owner, Mrs. Lee, arrives at the shop to settle the bill for the grooming service. While she pays the bill, So-Yeon cradles the cat in her arms and plays with it. Right then, a shadowy figure stands by the other side of the store's glass pane, but when So-Yeon looks in that direction, it vanishes. She doesn't notice the small palm prints on the smooth surface of the glass. Later, as Mrs. Lee walks back to her car, So-Yeon notices a little girl petting Bidanyi, but she inexplicably disappears when a car passes by. Upon arriving at her apartment building, Mrs. Lee enters an elevator, but its door refuses to close. In addition, Bidanyi starts to grow restless and aggressive. It desperately tries to get away from her hold. This makes Mrs. Lee very frustrated, but before she can take action, the door closes. When it opens again on the 11th floor, Mr. Lee is greeted by a grim sight of his wife lying dead on the elevator floor. An unharmed Bidanyi meows from the corner, licking its lips as if it enjoyed a meal. The scene then cuts back to So-Yeon, who visits her therapist. Through their conversation, we learn that she is battling with a trauma, claustrophobia, stemming from a harrowing childhood experience involving a fire incident. When the therapist asks about her emotional progress, she talks about how she tried riding the subway on her own, but the fear of the elevator still persists. Later, on her way to the pet shop, So-Yeon discovers about Mrs. Lee's death, and the police are seen investigating the scene. When she sees Bidanyi, she approaches the police officer, who happens to be her best friend's ex-boyfriend, Joon-Suk. She requests that he hand over the cat to her, and he complies, knowing that she has experience with animals. Following this, So-Yeon arrives at work, where her boss is completely against the idea of keeping Bidanyi there. He claims that it'll push customers away, since it came from a dead owner. Despite this, she puts the cat in a cage and gets on with her work. After a while, she momentarily looks at the window, and suddenly is startled by the sight of a little girl with cat-like eyes standing right outside. Says the girl. However, when she double checks, she finds nobody. After work, So-Yeon is walking back home with Bidanyi in her hands. During this, she feels a creepy sensation of being followed by someone, but she sees no one in sight. So-Yeon lives alone in her apartment, and due to her claustrophobia, she has no doors at her place. Nothing eliminates claustrophobia like having no exits. While playing with the cat, she receives a call from her best friend, Bo-Hee, who casually talks about adopting a cat. Amidst their conversation, So-Yeon mentions running into Joon-Suk earlier in the day, but her friend is unfazed and tells her that she doesn't mind the two of them going out. After the call, as So-Yeon is playing with the cat, it suddenly stares at something under the bed before making its way in. Curious, So-Yeon peers under the bed to pull out the cat, but she senses the presence of someone looking at her. When she bends down to take a second look, a ghostly face charges towards her, scaring her heart out. She then lets out a loud scream and frantically crawls back, panting heavily. The following day, So-Yeon goes to her therapist and tells her everything. However, the latter says that the little girl she saw can be a reflection of her younger self, aging back to when she experienced her trauma. So why did it say So-Yeon asks. Later that day, So-Yeon and Bo-Hee board a bus, heading towards a cat shelter. Turns out that Bo-Hee is searching for a long-haired cat in order to practice her grooming skills. However, So-Yeon doesn't like this. She nags her friend for being selfish and using cats as practice tools. Upon arrival, they discover that the shelter, which is filled with numerous caged cats, is dusty and somewhat neglected. There, they meet one of the workers, Mr. Long, who guides them around the place. In the midst of this, So-Yeon's attention is caught by a cat that appears to be in a very bad condition. Meanwhile, Bo-Hee comes across another cat, which she finds particularly appealing, and decides to adopt it. Mr. Long then excuses himself for a moment and enters a separate room. There, he picks up a couple of dead cats and throws them into an incinerator. When he gets back, So-Yeon points out a cat that just collapsed inside the cage. Regardless, Mr. Long ignores it and walks out with Bo-Hee and her chosen pet. As soon as they leave, the door shuts down down on its own, leaving So-Yeon stuck inside. Seeing this, her claustrophobia kicks in, and she starts banging on the door, screaming to be let out. Her visions turn hazy, and she begins to choke, spitting out some balls of fur. But before the situation can get any worse, her friend finds her and helps her up. "I know you're a vegan, but we gotta get you on a better diet," she says. Meanwhile, at the police station, Joon-Suk and his fellow officers go through the CCTV footage of Mrs. Lee in the elevator. The recording captures Bidanyi escaping her grasp, after which she looks in its direction with fear. Shortly after, she falls backward and fights an invisible force until her final breath. With this evidence, the officers conclude that the woman succumbed to a panic attack. The next evening at work, So-Yeon stumbles upon a storage room and finds it filled with deceased cats. To her terror, a hand unexpectedly emerges from the bodies and grabs her ankle. In a frantic struggle, she somehow manages to free herself and run out of the place. Even from outside, she spots the mysterious cat-eyed girl in the room. Moments later, Joon-Suk arrives and thoroughly checks the place, but he finds nothing amiss. Being a kind gentleman, he then walks her back home. After going through the unsettling events of the day, So-Yeon has a hard time falling asleep that night. When she finally does, she experiences a nightmare of a decapitated Bidanyi and her father. She abruptly jolts awake in a cold sweat, but smiles upon seeing Bidanyi's tail moving from underneath the blanket. She pulls off the blanket, only to be startled by the presence of the little girl. The following day, So-Yeon goes to pay her father's bills at the psychiatric hospital, but she leaves without even seeing him. Afterwards, she goes to Bo-Hee's place, where she finds her enthusiastically preparing to groom her new pet. However, the cat appears to be uncooperative, as it scratches Bo-Hee and dashes into the closet. As she attempts to pull out the fashion-hating cat, she is confronted by the eerie sight of the cat-eyed girl again, standing by her closet. So-Yeon, who is unaware of this chilling presence, sees the closet door closing on its own. She then decides to check on her friend in the dimly lit room, where the lights aren't working. When she approaches the closet, she notices a pair of feet among the hanging clothes. As she draws closer and parts the clothes, she finds the little girl standing, freaking So-Yeon out. The girl's movement then causes the hanging clothes to fall, revealing Bo-Hee's lifeless body. Despite being horrified by this discovery, So-Yeon acts quickly and rushes her friend to the hospital, but sadly, the doctors are unable to save her, and her body is transported to the morgue via elevator. Initially hesitant to enter the elevator, So-Yeon nervously steps in. During this, she witnesses blood spreading on the sheet, covering Bo-Hee's body. She frantically claims that her friend is alive, but the doctors ignore her, presuming her to be emotionally broken. So-Yeon then lifts up the cover and sees her friend still dead. But as she puts the cover back on, Bo-Hee opens her eyes and grabs her wrist, freaking her out. As a result, she screams in terror, and the doctors rush to comfort her. "Where's that meowing coming from?" A short while later, Joon-Suk also arrives at the hospital, visibly devastated by the tragic news. Overwhelmed by the loss of his ex-girlfriend, he vents his anger and frustration on So-Yeon, blaming her for everything. On the following day, So-Yeon accidentally cuts her finger while cooking. As she bleeds, Bidanyi unexpectedly shows up and begins licking the wound. Seeing an evil nature of the cat, she pushes it away, only to be met with a growling response. So-Yeon doesn't want to keep the pet anymore, so she cages it up and decides to hand it over to Mr. Lee. But upon reaching there, the man refuses to take it back and even offers to pay her to continue caring for it instead. Desperate to get rid of the cat, So-Yeon decides to abandon it in an isolated area. As she proceeds to walk away, she stumbles upon an elderly woman who seems to be lost. Concerned, So-Yeon escorts her to the police station, where she learns that the woman is suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Shortly after, her son arrives at the station and takes her home. Just before So-Yeon leaves, Joon-Suk approaches her and apologizes for his earlier outburst. He then vows to delve deeper into the mystery of the unexplained deaths. He calls the animal shelter to inquire about Bo-Hee's cat, but the call is abruptly cut off. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Mr. Long is seen injecting the cats with lethal drugs and photographing them before throwing them into the incinerator. However, at one point, the incinerator door malfunctions, refusing to close properly. As he investigates, he's suddenly pulled by the cat-eyed girl. She locks him inside the incinerator and burns him to death. She laughs. On the other hand, So-Yeon is at her home when she hears some noise from outside. Peering through a peephole, she notices the same toy she once used to play with Bidanyi dangling. When she squints to take a better look, the ghostly girl suddenly appears in front of her, causing her to retreat back in fear. At the same moment, she receives a call from Joon-Suk, who asks her to accompany him to the animal shelter. Once there, they discover the photographs of numerous cats that have been killed, including Bo-Hee's. Just then, a strange noise leads them to the incinerator room, where they come across a disturbing sight: the burnt body of Mr. Long. After witnessing all of these deaths, So-Yeon discerns a commonality. All victims were found in enclosed spaces, such as an elevator, closet, and now the incinerator. Thus, she concludes that the perpetrator is incapable of killing in open areas. In search of more answers, So-Yeon visits the Animal Rescue Association, where she learns about the origins of this sinister tale. It turns out that there was an infestation of stray cats in the basement of Dong-Ha apartment building. When the residents started to complain about it, the doors and windows of the basement were cemented shut, and the cats were left to suffocate. 2 weeks later, the workers removed all the dead bodies of the cats and incinerated them. The scene then cuts to the pet shop, where So-Yeon's boss finds Bidanyi peeking through the window. He lets it in, confines it in a cage, and puts it in the storage room as he aggressively tries to shut off its loud cries. The creepy girl appears from behind and whispers into his ears. When he turns around, she brutally attacks and kills him. Later, when So-Yeon arrives at the shop, she is terrified to witness the dead body of her boss. In the aftermath, she vows to put an end to this madness. She makes a brave decision to investigate Dong-Ha apartment building, despite her claustrophobia. On her way, she encounters the same old lady with Alzheimer's, who is searching for her missing granddaughter, Hee-Jin. So-Yeon then calls Joon-Suk to obtain the lady's address, while she decides to follow her. Heeding to her request, Joon-Suk examines the old files and discovers that the old woman reported her missing granddaughter 9 months ago, but her son closed the case. In the meantime, So-Yeon follows the old lady to her place, which happens to be in Dong-Ha's apartment. There, she makes a shocking discovery: a photograph of Hee-Jin, who is none other than the same cat-eyed girl she has been seeing this entire time. Before she can question further about the matter, she's kicked out by the old woman's son. At the same time, she spots Bidanyi and follows it to the building's basement, where she's confronted by a swarm of cats. In an attempt to fight them off, So-Yeon accidentally falls into an empty water tank, which sets her in a panic. Soon after, the cat-eyed girl reveals herself, but this time, she shows how she died. It turns out that Hee-Jin used to play with the cats in the very same basement. When she learned about plans to kill them, she tried to hide them in the water tank, but during her rescue process, she unfortunately fell into the same tank and died, with cats surrounding her. Here, we learn that Hee-Jin is actually Halle Berry. The tormented spirit of the mistreated cats, seeking retribution against those who harmed them. So-Yeon, being a kind-hearted human being, is let free by the spirit. In the final scene, So-Yeon visits her father in the psychiatric facility and spends some time with him. While leaving the place, she takes the elevator for the first time, finally gathering courage to face her fear. But people are still gonna get killed by these cats. I don't understand. Subscribe for more videos like this. Turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.